Hi everyone, so today I'll be going over my top 10 games of all time, and I had the most difficult time forming my list of just 10 games. So I do kind of cheat a little here and there. So when I get to those parts, I will sort of try to explain myself, and so hopefully you guys will understand sort of why I cheated. I think the most difficult part of forming this list was how to balance the modern games that I played more recently with all the nostalgic games that I just have a lot of fond memories for. So I try to fuse those two kind of points together to form this list. So I hope you guys enjoy. I do plan on doing more top 10 lists. I was thinking of doing console specific lists, so like my top 10 Switch games, 3DS games, etc. And also go into maybe some top 10 genre games eventually. But let's start with my 10th pick. So when I decided on this 10th pick, it was a little surprising for me, but the more I thought about it, the more I thought it really did deserve to be on my top 10. And that is Hades. And so I did play it for the Nintendo Switch, but it's available on a lot of other modern consoles. And this is my first roguelike game, and I think there were just so many great elements that made this just a fantastic experience. You have things like the heavy metal music, just always playing in the background. You have a great sort of tie-ins to Greek lore with the story and all the different characters, and the art was also really fantastic. So this AAA indie title just had so many fantastical elements that really worked well for me. And it was just such an addicting experience for me when I first got it, so I think that's why this really just deserved to be on my top 10 for now. So for number 9, we're going to get into some nostalgic games now. And I was reviewing my PS2 collection and all the games I remembered playing on the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance when I was younger. And there are a few titles that just really stuck with me that I still remember very fondly to this day. And the first one of those is Kingdom Hearts 2. So I did talk a little bit about my Kingdom Hearts experience during my PS2 collection video. And really these first two games just really stuck with me throughout the years. Even though I haven't really played many of the offshoots or the third game yet. There's just something very magical that the first two games offered me when I started playing these back when I was maybe in middle school or something. And at the time, I was never a big Final Fantasy fan or a Disney fanatic, but something about the Kingdom Hearts lore just really captivated me. And I love the exploration and all the little side characters, interactions, and I guess kind of the hack and slash combat just really appealed to me when I was younger as well, as something very approachable. But with the second game here, I think I just really enjoyed how they started expanding the Kingdom Hearts lore specifically with Organization 13 and all these other sort of offshoots that make Kingdom Hearts have its own identity apart from Final Fantasy and Disney. But yeah, over the years, I just remember returning to this game multiple times in different playthroughs, and it's just something that stuck with me to this day. Now for number 8, this is another PS2 classic that I have very fond memories for that I showed off in my PS2 collection video, and that is Jak and Daxter, the Precursor Legacy. So I'm holding up the first game here sort of as a marker for the entire trilogy, so I'm cheating a little bit here. But I just really enjoy the progression of the series as we kind of watched Jak and Daxter mature and darken over time. Though I really do have a ton of fond memories of this first one here. And I think this is the one I probably replayed the most. Tried collecting all the orbs and things like that. I think when it comes to the trilogy, the second game, Jak 2, was my favorite. And while the mechanics were a little bit janky, but most of the 3D action platformers on the PS2 were a little janky at the time that you kind of have to get used to. You really just see the maturity of their journey throughout the next two games that I just really, I think, appreciated in my adolescence when I was also, maturing as a teenager. Next is a more modern game from one of my favorite franchises. And for this video, I tried to just stick with one game per franchise, though, as you'll see towards the end of my list, there is an exception to this. But Fire Emblem is a very important series to me because it introduced me to the strategy RPG genre, which I've totally taken to in recent years. And I had some difficulty deciding which one to go with because all the Fire Emblems that I've played have their own little caveats and differences. But I decided to go with one on the 3DS, Fire Emblem Echoes, Shadow of Valentia. So this is a remake of the second Fire Emblem game that was never localized in the US. And I think what made this really special to me was the story. Because this was a remake of one of the earlier games, this didn't have the relationship building that we've seen in the more modern Fire Emblem games, starting with Awakening. And I sort of appreciated how that became less of a focus, and we started just seeing the built-up relationships within the parties of characters as a whole. And I like how there's sort of two different routes that you play simultaneously throughout this game, and how it eventually does sort of come together with a very satisfying ending. When it comes to the tactical elements of the gameplay, it's not the most challenging Fire Emblem game out of all the ones I've played, but you can definitely, I think, alter your experience depending on what difficulty level you choose at the beginning. But regardless, I really enjoyed each of the map campaigns and how they didn't really seem like filler side battles, but they were more kind of deliberate in how they played with the story. But even though I did choose Shadows of Valentia here as my top Fire Emblem pick, I could have easily also interchanged this with Fire Emblem Awakening, which was my first Fire Emblem game. But again, I think kind of the story on this one really kind of gave it a leg up, and is currently my favorite Fire Emblem game. This is another game that is not a console exclusive, but I did play it for the Nintendo Switch, and that is Witcher 3 here. And while the Nintendo Switch is not the best way to experience this game, I know, especially not graphically, despite all that, I thought it was just a really great experience on handheld. So I came into this game not knowing too much about the Witcher franchise, but I think this game just does a really fantastic job of just transporting you into this sort of medieval fantasy sort of setting. Out of all the open world games on the market nowadays, I think The Witcher 3 just does a really good job at having a very likable protagonist with a lot of cool different side missions and lore kind of wrapped within this open world game. And I haven't actually completely finished this game. I definitely haven't gone into all the DLC yet. I found with a lot of games that I really enjoy, it's hard for me to finish them because after I get through everything, it finally becomes the end, and there's nothing kind of new to look forward to until a new game is announced, which, while there is a new Witcher game announced, who knows when that's ever going to come out at this point. So I've been kind of taking my time with the DLC, and I'm planning to revisit this world sometime soon. All right, so for the last PS2 nostalgic pick, I have Psychonauts here. So I did have an awfully difficult time ranking all of my PS2 games, especially the 3D action platformers, because they all just hold a very special place in my heart. But kind of reflecting back on the stories and sort of the unique features of each of them, Psychonauts just really stood out to me, not only because of the unique artwork and sort of psychic abilities you could have in this game. The entire package just really stood out to me, and I just have a lot of fond memories playing this game, especially with my brother back in the day, and kind of how wrapped up we got into the entire adventure. And because of my nostalgic pull, I did end up ordering the I Am 8-Bit collection for the sequel game that's going to be coming out later this year. So that includes physical versions of both the first remastered game as well as the sequel that I've yet to play. So I'm really looking forward to that. I did hear that the PS4 remaster of the first game is not as good as the PS2. So I'm curious to see kind of why that is. If it's because of the controls just don't really lend itself well to modern consoles, or if there's something else that kind of puts you out of kind of that space of when you're playing it on the original hardware, or if it's just because of how the game has aged over time. It's been years since I've actually gone back to this game. So one of my fears actually when it comes to all these nostalgic games is how does it hold up today for me? So while a part of me really does want to replay a lot of these games, sort of rekindle all those nostalgic feelings that I had back in the day, part of me is also just kind of worried that they just won't land the same way and sort of ruin those memories. So I'm not sure how you guys cope with nostalgic games, if you try to just keep them as good memories and not touch them again, or if you do tend to revisit them to sort of experience those feelings again. But yeah, I'm going to be testing, I guess, this theory with Psychonauts eventually, maybe sometime this year. All right, so we're now down to my fourth pick of my favorite games of all time. And when I'm going to be holding up this game, it's really just the entire series, but this is my favorite game in the series, and that is The Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky. So this is the second game in the Trails to the Sky story arc. As a few of you picked up, my channel name is actually heavily inspired by the Trails games, with Orbital being sort of one of the mechanics for the battle systems. I'm awful with coming up with original names, so I kind of just stuck with that one, and I kind of like how Orbology rolls off the tongue. So we actually never received the Vita version in the West of this game. However, these Vita editions were actually remasters of these games, so graphically they look a lot nicer. And so what fans did was they took the translations from Steam and basically copy and pasted them onto the Japanese version. So I think this is probably the best way to experience these games, and I have no regrets doing that. But when it comes to the love for this particular game, I don't want to get into spoiler territory, but this game has a lot of different revelations the characters sort of get into, and there's a lot of different twists and turns, which is just one of the, I think, highlighting features of the Trails story as a whole. And my favorite character in the Trails games is Estelle, and I just really loved seeing sort of her character progression throughout the series, and this game, I think especially, is a very pivotal point for her. I've of course not played all the Trails games yet. I'm actually highly anticipating the Crossbell duology localization, so my favorite in the series might change, and we of course have the new games that haven't been localized yet either, but for now it is the sequel here. Alright, so now we're on to my top three. Starting with Xenoblade Chronicles, the definitive edition for the Nintendo Switch. And this is the first Xenoblade game I've ever played, and I was just so taken by the story. I've said before that this first game here has just an epic story, and it definitely does. There's just so many different twists and turns throughout the narrative, whether it's through cliffhangers or just something that completely catches you by surprise. There are just so many different moments in the story that kept me on the edge of my seat. And while this first game, I think hands down has the best story, saying that the Xenoblade games in general have, I think, captured really well, that's really resonated with me, is kind of a built-up atmosphere. And while none of these games are actually a true open world experience, there's just something truly magical these games do that really just suck me in to the specific world where I don't really feel like I'm really working hard to do a bunch of grinding or side missions and sort of have that, I guess, escapist experience. But yeah, if you haven't played the Xenoblade games yet, I highly recommend checking out this first one here especially. But I also did enjoy the second one and highly anticipating the third one coming out very soon. Alright, so we're down to my second favorite game of all time, and this is again where I'm going to be cheating a little bit. So I'm going to be holding up one game, but I'm really referring to two games here. So here we have Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds, but this game is heavily influenced by, if not related to, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, which I ended up playing the port version on the Game Boy Advance way back in the day, and it was definitely one of my favorite childhood games. So I guess I'll speak to the original first, A Link to the Past. I just remember as a kid just loving the exploration of this game and not really knowing where you needed to go, and so just through exploration and kind of discovering the little secrets of what was hidden in the map, I kind of pieced together what you need to do, what sort of tool you need to take. And I just loved how you can seamlessly go between the different worlds, the dark Hyrule and I guess the light Hyrule. And just as a kid, I remember really loving how that played into a lot of the puzzles throughout the game. So fast forward a couple of decades to when A Link Between Worlds came out. I mentioned this before, but this was the game that got me back into gaming in grad school. Throughout college and early grad school, I wasn't really playing any games, but when I heard that this sequel of sorts was announced on the 3DS, I went ahead and bought the limited edition that came with the digital copy of the game, and I just loved how it did remind me a lot of A Link to the Past, but with sort of the new fresh coat of paint and the new wall moving mechanic I thought was just really innovative. And again, this was my first 3DS game ever, so it was really a neat experience all around, and what got me back into handheld gaming again. So yeah, both these games I deeply love, so I had to have both of them in here, and because they're very similar, I thought it made sense to kind of combine them into my number 2 spot. So last but not least is my favorite game of all time, and here I sort of feel like I'm cheating again because I did just talk about this franchise, and I feel like everyone and their mothers puts this game as their favorite game of all time nowadays, but it is Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. But yes, I feel like this is a little bit of the anticlimactic #1 spot, but it's #1, I think, for a good reason. Many of you are probably very familiar with this game, so I won't go into too many specifics. But the thing I just love about this game is we finally got Zelda in a true open world sort of setting. There are just so many cool elements kind of hidden throughout this game that I'm actually still haven't done 100% yet. I've mentioned earlier how there are games that I really love, but I can't really bring myself to complete them because then they'll be over. This is another example of those. I haven't done the DLC yet, even though I bought it. And I haven't also beaten Ganon, the final boss, yet. So I just kind of keep leaving it off and just exploring all that the open world has to offer with all the little hidden secrets and things to collect and little side quests too. So I am, of course, very much looking forward to the sequel coming out next year. I'm curious how it's going to hold up compared to this first game and sort of what new direction they decide to go with it to change things up. But yeah, I guess I will conclude this video here. Thank you for watching. Were any of these games a surprise? I feel like most of these probably won't be. Maybe Hades was a little bit of a surprise to have made it to my top 10, but I feel like I've talked about a lot of these games so many times on this channel. You guys are maybe sick of hearing me talk about them. And I think moving forward, there's so many different games that I own in my collection that I really want to play that I feel like are contenders to make it to my top 10 list. As I mentioned, I do plan on doing more top 10 lists in the future that are going to be system specific as well as probably genre specific. There's going to be, of course, crossover with games that I talked about on this video with all those, but I was thinking of maybe also adding some honorable mentions for those videos just so that I'm not repeating the same games all the time throughout these videos. But anyway, let me know what your top 10 games of all time are, and also how do you go about mixing your nostalgic games with the more modern games that you've been playing recently, and how that all forms into your top 10 list. But anyway, until my next video, bye guys.